And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network. Well, that's at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the original Coalition Digital, pre-digital, analog 1.0 website. You can find a lot of our older material at coalitionradio.us. Well, a special edition of the Coalition tonight. Someone that I've had the distinct pleasure of now working with, if you will. Some great late night conversations, some great early morning conversations about, well, the primary political / medical / sociological / economic force in all of our lives right now. And of course, that's COVID-19. Dr. Andrew Bostom is a graduate of Downstate SUNY Medical School. He's done master's work in epidemiology at the Brown University and is a published author on a wide array of materials, a lot of focusing on the Middle East. Truly a Renaissance man in a time when, well, literal thought, constructive thought, reasoning seems to be in dire short supply. Dr. Bostom, welcome to the Coalition, and thanks for joining us tonight. And, well, thanks for being a part of the conversation writ large here in Rhode Island.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Pat.
You have become sort of a life force, if you will, for those folks who are, after a year plus of seeing lives upturned, lives lost, businesses destroyed, economies laid low, you become a force for those who are still have inquiring minds, folks who are not willing to just accept what they're spoon-fed and crave, if you will, information, truth, science, all the things that our American government, our state and local governments, quote unquote, speak to and often use as a social force against those who question authority, but for whom real answers seem to be in pretty short supply. First of all, talk a little bit about your background, if you will. I understand we share some roots from one of the truly, I think of that as a sort of the cauldron for strength. And of course, I'm talking about Brooklyn. Brooklyn and Queens, people come out of Brooklyn and Queens with superpowers. If you can survive Brooklyn and Queens, well, you've just you're at a different level in terms of life force. But tell us a little about yourself and how did you end up in Rhode Island, like so many of us expatriates from the old country, and what's driven you, if you will, to become such a powerful commentator on all things COVID?
I grew up in Queens originally. I was born in Flushing Hospital. We moved to Veterans Co-op in Queens Village, eventually out to Little Neck, which was very suburban at that point. And when I was out on my own, I moved back to Queens Village. My wife moved in with me. We went to medical school together. We commuted to Downstate from Queens Village, so when you're in medical school as a couple, and we got married during a lunch break in our in our first year of medical school. By a black woman judge in Queens, and then we came back and said, "Well, where'd you go?" He said, "Oh, we got married," and people thought it was a joke, and then they realized we actually had gotten married. But see, they put you in a couples match. So fast forward a couple of years after that, when we were applying for residency, and we wound up geographically matching together in Rhode Island, and my wife went on to do dermatology, and I did internal medicine. But we matched at Rhode Island Hospital, and we've been here ever since.
How do you like Rhode Island? I mean, for some of us, it's particularly in the first few years. I'll use the analogy: strangers in a strange land. And then all of a sudden, one day you're back visiting the old country in New York, and you're driving up Connecticut, and you pass through the magical exit 93 into the behind the curtain, if you will, and you feel this audible slash clear sense of relief, and then you realize, my God, I'm one of them. What's it got to be like for someone from the city, the real city, that is?
Well, it's been a couple of, maybe a two-stage adjustment. So when we were in residency, we lived in Providence, for convenience to be close to the hospital. But we moved out to Foster, Gloucester, and that was a huge change certainly from Queens, but also from the east side of Providence. It's very rural where we live, and it's nice. It's also, you're not locked into the sort of east side mindset, shall we say?
Right.
Politically, socially, culturally. I really like it out here. Besides it's physically beautiful. It's more a real slice of America. It's not reflexively, leftist and with everything that comes with that. It's tradespeople. It's people really from all walks of life and very more independent people. Lots of gun owners, farmers. It's been a wonderful change.
But the true issue that we faced in coming to Cumberland, where we live, was that we asked a very important question after we closed in the house, and we asked, where can you get really good pizza? And we were told Papa Gino's, and then we realized, my God, what have we done?
No. It depends. For thin sliced pizza, go to Fellini's.
Oh, we do. I love Wickenden Street. Yeah, they may have torn down.
And actually, Pat, one of the gifts that my late beloved stepfather gave us when we moved up here, 30 years ago now, was two New York steel Sicilian pizza pans.
Wow.
So over the years, I've learned how to make, that's the only style I honestly can make, what cooking I do. I make Sicilian style pizza here now. These days I make my own sauce and stuff too. But it's other than Fellini's, I haven't had good pizza in Rhode Island.
and all of a sudden, you've just heard people knocking on the door in protest. But the other question, and we'll get to the real issue at heart in a second. But the other question, there was a great Jewish deli on Hope Street years ago that left this mortal coil, probably about 10, 12 years ago. Other than that, what they call bagels up here are an abomination. I mean, it's just
Pat, you just pressed the button. Yes. And as a matter of fact, after all, it took a long time. Both my wife and I have been cooking up a storm, since COVID, especially when the kids came home from college and we were stuck with them again. And but that's it, because I could not get good bagels. So I actually make really good bagels now. I taught myself finally this year how to make bagels, and they're actually more Montreal style than New York. It's very chewy inside, but a very very crusty on the outside. So they're not actually typical New York bagels, which I was never that crazy about, because we once made a trip to Montreal and I said, these are the bagels. If I ever learn how to make bagels, I want to make these.
Oh boy. No, it's that New Jersey soft rolls, but that's full versions of the Sunday New York Times. That's the other thing.
Yeah, I have a certain nostalgia for that, but they're so truly, well, from my perspective, they're so truly toxic now. I don't bother. I mean, every once in a while, those certain stories I'll follow online, but I've long since stopped buying the New York Times.
Oh, there you go. And the Daily News. I go back to Dondi and the Daily News. That's another newspaper who's rough stuff.
It used to be an alternative, certainly a much more conservative political perspective. And now it's just, I guess the Post has really picked up that mantle, which is kind of odd, because the Post historically, was quite to the left, and it's shifted over. But yeah, the Daily News used to be the conservative newspaper, the daily newspaper that was widely read in New York for many years.
And bringing it back to Rhode Island, being the Renaissance man you are, you clearly spend a lot of time, and I love it's. I've really enjoyed getting to know you because we've spoken about a number of other issues. But, if you were looking at the Providence Journal when we moved here, first of all, there was a Sunday Providence Journal magazine. That was a woman named Martha Smith ran it. It was fabulous. It was literally a mini, if you will, New York Times Sunday magazine. But, the Providence Journal used to be effectively the AAA ball club for the New York Times. I think Mr. Sulzberger himself is if you will, an alumnus of the original Providence Journal, which was owned locally until the last 15 or 20 years, and was a marvelous newspaper. And that kind of plays into some of the narrative we're going to talk about tonight, because it was a paper of record. It was kind of Rhode Island's own Gray Lady. And, I joke about it, but the late, great Vincent A. Buddy Cianci would be referred to. And it's sort of a neat little reflection on this, how words were wordsmithed, if you will, in the Providence Journal. He would be referred to. He would never be called Buddy Cianci. He was Vincent A. apostrophe Buddy Cianci. And it was and that was just sort of a kind of a cosmetic reflection on how seriously the news of the day was taken. And, at the time there were a dozen or so, maybe probably even more, local Providence Journal outlets. Out in the East Bay, the West Bay, Providence, they'd all have their own version or an edition inside the paper. And it was truly an amazing read. It was, if you love newspapers and you love to read and you just love to study, it was amazing. And when we come full forward, one of the reasons that you and I met and chatted, as you've had with a number of folks in the independent media community, that the sheer absence, if you will, now of any of that sort of in-depth reporting or, just a real focus on the truth and news.
Pat, you, to your great credit, you referred in the presser last week, when you addressed both the governor and Dr. Scott, you referred to, as far as I'm concerned, the only true investigative reporting that's been done for the entire year plus now on COVID. Mm-hmm. And it was the last piece written by Ed Acorn before he was retired from the Providence Journal. It was published last April 30th. And it included the figures that you were alluding to in your question last week, which showed the projections. Your question remains unanswered. Who was responsible for these model results, which were implanted at the Department of Health website for at least a month or so, and they predicted between 2,250 and 4,300 patients would be hospitalized with COVID at peak census, which was going to happen roughly by the end of April last year, or by May 3rd. And you asked the appropriate question. But by the way, the peak census was 375 on April 28th. And Ed Acorn investigated all this, and he found that the models were put together by some still mysterious group between the Department of Health and Brown University, and I'm assuming the epidemiologists and statisticians over there. And your question was just brushed off and never answered. Like, who specifically was responsible for predicting 6 to 11-fold more patients, which is really overrunning the hospitals was why we were ostensibly locked down, and we never came close to these projections. And my concern is that these are the same people, unnamed, that are going to be modeling us out, so to speak, to lift these restrictions. And if you heard Governor McKee's interview this morning with Tara Granahan on WPRO, he won't give an answer. Although at the same time, Pat, this is what's so ironic about all this. He's very gung ho now, and to his credit, to dismantle the overflow facility at the convention center, and that by definition, Pat, means the emergency is clearly over. If he's doing that, it's clearly over. And yet he won't relinquish the emergency powers, and we don't have any metrics as to what will actually get us out. We've been hovering at the same low rate of infections for almost 2 months now, and they keep raising what I and many others now call panic pornography, about, are there going to be COVID variants that are going to afflict us? They never cite lots of reassuring information about one of these variants, which is the B.1.1.7 variant, which became the predominant variant in the UK. And by the way, Pat, just tonight, the Telegraph, I guess what used to be called the London Telegraph, now it's just called the Telegraph, ran a lead story that they're announcing by Monday. They project that Britain will have reached, the UK will have reached herd immunity. Over 73% of the population will have some form of immunity, much of it naturally acquired immunity from infections. Also, the extensive amount of vaccination that they've done, that's in the teeth of the UK variant becoming the overwhelmingly predominant variant there. We also have the state of Texas, where I just checked. There are virologists that have put together websites that will chronicle the impact of the variants that are out there. And Texas is about 60% now UK variant. Well, they're wide open, and they're doing very well. You just saw the crowds for the opening of the Texas Rangers baseball season. Their hospitalizations are way down. Even their infection rates are down. Their deaths are way down. And that's, again, in the teeth of having 60% convert from the original, if you want to call it the native or Wuhan strain, to the much feared B.1.1.7 variant. It's just the same thing with Georgia and Florida. They're at least 50% of this variant. They're open. Florida's been open pretty much since September, and they're doing very well. And now you can find some counter narratives, Pat. Michigan's having some issues. They have a lot of this variant. There are other parts of Europe that aren't doing so well who have this variant. But you have to balance that out with the overall picture, which shows a lot of reassuring data. And we also have some evidence from they have to do laboratory studies for this, but they're all we have at this point. You can isolate sera from people that either have recovered from natural infections or at a set period of time after vaccination. And there appears to be a lot of activity, at least in the laboratory, against many of the variants, including this UK variant, from people that, again, have convalesced, they're recovered from the infection, or they've gotten vaccine-induced immunity. So there's more than enough information out there if you're going to give a balanced picture to say that it's not so dire when it comes to these variants, and let's just get the ball rolling. And the other thing is, Pat, the bottom line for me is, if you look at per capita mortality across the United States, if anything, the states that had the lesser restrictions overall have done better. And that's just one aspect. That's COVID per capita mortality. They're doing far better in terms of getting kids back to school, economic recovery, et cetera. So overall, I would say it's very clear the verdict is in, that the states that locked down less or opened sooner, however you want to put that, are doing much better than the states like ours that have been so slow to really fully reopen.
It's just sort of like a movie. We've started with sort of the near end, and let's go back in time. And let's do a little bit of analysis on the first 7, 8, 9 months of our response. So last March, it became clear in the United States that there's an issue here, a serious issue, and regardless of where this came from, different individual states and the Trump administration at that point had decided to leave it to the state level to react. Individual states were reacting in their own manner. In Rhode Island, of course, we began the now infamous year-long 15-day flatten the curve. Let's start from there. What were your thoughts at the time as a medical professional, as a doctor, as an epidemiologist, as someone who does a lot of research, and clearly an independent thinker? What was honestly floating around in your head as all this started to well up right about a year from now?
I mean, initially, first of all, my background in epidemiology is really cardiovascular disease and chronic kidney disease epidemiology.
Hmm.
So while I would say as far back as January, seeing what might be coming, based on China and then Italy, I started to do the best I could to get up to speed and read papers and read other person's analyses and whatever, obviously whatever was in the lay press. I didn't have a very good sense, except perhaps for one insight, which I think still holds. Do you recall the cruise ship, the Diamond Princess,
Hmm.
which had it was a very good laboratory. It was really a floating laboratory for what might transpire, and it actually gave me some reassurance. It was the first bit of reassuring data that I saw, because I believe there were about 3,700 people confined, and in the end, only about 20% of them even became infected.
Hmm.
Infected where the early tests, would pick it up. I think that number expanded a little bit when they went to some of the antibody tests, but that's actually just picking up some additional asymptomatic infections.
Hmm.
So if you say that maybe even 30% of the ship was infected, that struck me that, if this was supposed to be, remember the origins were murky. This part wasn't necessarily murky. The idea that a virus can go from an animal species to humans is clearly not a new thing. It happens all the time with influenza, and it's called a zoonosis. But here there was this possibility that, God, could this have been a genetically re-engineered virus used for chemical warfare, the Wuhan lab, or were they just studying these bat coronaviruses and did they escape from the lab? And but so there was a lot of mystery and fear, I think, because of the unknown origins. But what the ship said was that, well, it's kind of behaving like a virus. Certain people are susceptible, and do badly. So there were 7 deaths, but that was the other thing that gave us an inkling if we paid attention. There were 7 deaths from the Diamond Princess, as it turned out, and they were all over 70. So or 70, all 70 and older. No one under 70 died, and that would become a quick theme. And again, 70% of the passengers, even if you now include those that had completely asymptomatic infections that were only picked up later with antibody testing, that would imply that there was some natural resistance, immunity, whatever you want to call it. In other words, because a lot of the fear pornography began with the idea that this is totally novel and all human beings, all mankind is naive to it. They've never seen anything like this before, and therefore it could be cataclysmic. And again, if you step back and looked at what happened on this very closed environment, where they even if they started doing some preventive measures after the fact, everyone was exposed, Pat. I mean, you're on a cruise ship, right. Everyone was exposed. So I found that actually rather reassuring, and then. When even in New York, which was so hard hit, if you recall, it was still, and then with some very bad decision making on the part of the governor, it was still largely confined to frail elderly, particularly institutionalized elderly, in terms of the worst of the worst. Right. And that's really what had played out in Italy too. So I guess it's kind of a long-winded way of saying that and not that the elderly are disposable, but there was a large swath of the population that appeared to be at lesser risk for at least the truly catastrophic outcomes, ICU hospitalization and death, and then obviously people less than 70 could get the disease too, and there's been a mortality and severe disease in that population, but overwhelmingly And then I learned historically, this was a disease of the elderly. And historically, there actually had been, this is really a fascinating story, which I only learned some months later. There was something called the so-called Russian flu in the late 1880s, early 1890s. It lasted several years at that time. Molecular biologists and infectious disease epidemiologists have gone back and have gone back and traced it to actually a zoonosis that jumped from cows to humans at that point, and it turns out it's a coronavirus. It's not an influenza virus. That's the best understanding that we have now, and that it caused a very serious pandemic. Back again, beginning 1889, but over the years, it's evolved into one of the cold-causing coronaviruses that circulate seasonally now. And they basically cause a cold flu syndrome. Occasionally, you can still see some small outbreaks in nursing homes. And so that also was of interest to me, that maybe, let's hope, that'll be the ultimate trajectory for SARS-CoV-2.
Well, and if you could give us a little bit of analysis here. When you talk about cruise ships, very often, and it's obviously a serious illness, but at this point, the media looks as almost just a, if you will, an ongoing condition in cruise ships. And of course, we're talking about norovirus. So you've got norovirus, you've got influenza, you've got Legionnaire's disease, and of course now you've got COVID. How different? And I'm old enough, by the way, to remember the Legionnaire's disease when it actually hit an American Legion convention, right? And that was, I believe, in Philadelphia.
Right.
What are some of the differences in how these transmit and the severity of each? Because the news media will take a note of a norovirus only as if because of the human interest story of having a ship often stranded offshore until it works its course. Certainly not the collective nervous breakdown we had when that cruise ship was anchored off of Miami. So what are some of the differences in transmission and severity in some of these different diseases?
Yeah, so I think coronavirus and influenza viruses are very closely related. They're respiratory viruses. Legionnaire's disease is actually a bacterium. So it's different. And in terms of is it the Norwalk virus or the
norovirus?
Norovirus is a gastrointestinal virus. So really, the other two examples are quite different. So typically, gastrointestinal viruses, it's fecal oral transmission, not airborne aerosols. The Legionnaire's was eventually traced back to infected water supply. It's a very serious but less transmissible kind of illness, but there's a good class of antibiotics that can be used to treat it. Whereas influenza, pandemic influenza, and now pandemic coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, are spread by aerosol, and we're really still in the infancy of coming up with treatments. There are things that show promise. There are antiviral drugs that were developed to treat influenza, at least early, that seem to have some effects, but largely what's quelled influenza has been naturally acquired immunity or some vaccination programs, particularly targeted vaccination programs. We're seeing some advances now in terms of therapeutics with SARS-CoV-2. There are monoclonal antibody therapies that are showing some promise. There's a lot of work in the developing world, and increasingly now it's sort of having to be led and beaten over the head with some successes in the third world Of course, there was the whole hydroxychloroquine debacle. And as far as I'm concerned, there may actually still be some use for it, in limited outpatient use, very early treatment, particularly if other things aren't available. But there's also another antiparasitic drug which is showing a lot of promise, more promise, I think, than hydroxychloroquine really ever showed, and that's ivermectin. But it's really bizarre, Pat, the resistance to it. I'm not a conspiracist, so I don't get into any of that, but it's just very strange to me. There's a body of small randomized controlled trials which are showing some promise for ivermectin, and developing countries have employed it extensively. It's uncontrolled evidence, so it's hard to tease it all out. But it looks like it's having an effect. So I hope this sorts itself out, quickly. I think finally there's a big clinical trials unit at Oxford University. I had read that they're actually begun a trial of ivermectin to sort of follow up on some of these smaller randomized trials. The monoclonal antibodies that both Lilly and Regeneron have developed have looked very promising as early treatments. And now we have the mass administration of vaccines. So those are all, I think they're all promising. My personal opinion is that I'd like to see the vaccines more targeted, and the issue is now coming up. You and I have discussed this privately. The issue is now coming up of mandating vaccines for young people, and I take great objection to that. I don't. First of all the vaccines that are available, they're different. The two major platforms now are the mRNA vaccines and the adenovirus vector vaccines. These are all brand new platforms. These are not the old, what we got as children, either live attenuated viruses or deactivated viruses. These are new ways to deliver vaccines that are, and that's why the vaccines now are EUA, experimental use applications, because they haven't had enough time simply to be observed in human populations, not just for short-term efficacy in terms of preventing infections, but for safety. So to me, they should be carefully targeted towards the truly high risk. Obviously, that's not the policy that most are following. So it gives me some concern. But I really do draw a line at the young people, because college age and younger. This disease has turned out to be more benign, mercifully, even than seasonal flu, let alone pandemic flu. And so I think you really, and a lot of kids have been infected. And so they have a naturally acquired immunity. So when you hear, Roger Williams and now Brown mandating vaccination in the fall, where given the usual timetable for when these vaccines will be formally approved by the FDA, we're only about halfway through that process. It's usually at minimum a 2-year process. So I have real concerns about doing this, vaccinating the lowest of the low risk populations in a mandatory manner, and also we're operating in a void which could be of evidence. To his great credit, WPRO's Matt Allen, after the Roger Williams announcement, finally got them to provide him some information about not just the number of infections, but the number of hospitalizations at Roger Williams. And Pat, lo and behold, it turned out, I went to their, most universities now have what's called a COVID data dashboard, and you could see there were close to 200 infections that had occurred in among the students. And Matt found out, got an email that there were zero hospitalizations, right. Zero hospitalizations, and so. again, if this were something that affected that population more severely, and if it were a vaccine that had been out longer in terms of long-term potential effects, that would be a different question. But when you're working with what's essentially an experimental vaccine still at this point, and you're now targeting the lowest risk population, I think that should be purely voluntary. It should not be. It should not be mandated.
Well, and clearly, as so often happens, crises develop, if you will, new and yet to be determined results in terms of our civil liberties. The technology has always pushed the tests of our civil liberties and the incidents long before thoughtful people have gotten together and analyzed potential issues. Let's say some urban myths and legends here, and get into a little analysis. One of the things that's always perplexed me is this: when you and I joked about, well, we each have roots in Brooklyn, and so to see the impact be so severe in New York City, when you've got very similar living conditions, if you will, in the urban core here in Providence, Central Falls, Pawtucket, West Warwick, the eastern sort of core of the state is shockingly urban when compared to, say, out the western part of the state, a mere 10 miles away. I'm not aware of too many states that have that kind of diversity at such a scale relative to the state so close. So in New York City, it would, you had a near meltdown. I didn't see my daughter for months.
Right.
In Providence, you had, if you will, the intimation of a potential meltdown, yet,
right.
And we're going to get into death rates in a minute, but it always took on the appearance, and I think this was management style or lack of a near core meltdown that never really materialized in the severity that was often predicted. And there's impacts of that, by the way, that we'll talk about later in terms of, for no other way to describe it, the cried wolf syndrome is probably the most simplistic way. And you do that, and we're in a state right now in Rhode Island where no one really believes anything. You've got to, no matter what type of calm that our new governor and newish state administration puts on it, most Rhode Islanders at this point are thoroughly cynical and making their own decisions and being conservative, but simply don't believe anything the government says at this point. I think that's the true legacy of the Raimondo administration. I can't blame that on Dan McKay. He inherited this bleep storm. So right. Why such a difference? Let's look at Providence, New York, and now Brazil. Well, I mean, how these crazy extremes? And by the way, now the new narrative, and I'll allow you to perhaps flash some light on this. The new narrative is that Brazil will shortly be in the 13th century because of what's happening there. So give us kind of a late analysis of the relationships between the response and the actual death/infection rate in those areas.
Yeah, so if you look at per capita mortality, New Jersey is the highest. New York is the second in the United States. Massachusetts is the third, and we're fourth. Mm-hmm. So it is that northeastern corridor. Some of it could, simply put, could have to do with population density. Obviously, there's still the raging scandal about how Cuomo handled the nursing homes in New York. But I would say all four states have had a very significant problem in their nursing homes, including our state. Mm-hmm. We've run consistently, and it's not so much an issue of blame, although obviously I think there's a problem with what Cuomo did. I think that if you have a large institutionalized elderly population, per capita, just the way this disease evolved, that was a bad situation. So our mortality has been at least in the range of 60% plus coming from the institutionalized elderly. If you include elderly assisted living facilities, you're up to about 2/3 of the total mortality in Rhode Island. On the other hand, Pat, though, that tends to confine it, and in theory at least allows you an option to control the outbreak if you marshal your resources adequately, and perhaps not to, as far as from my perspective, punish the rest of the population so harshly. And unfortunately, I don't think any of those four northeastern states did that. So they failed in terms of and maybe fail is too harsh a word. The situation got out of control in the nursing homes, and yet the rest of the population, I think, was dealt with in too draconian a manner. If you look at the contrast, I guess the biggest contrast would be Florida. Now, first of all, Florida, on the one hand, has at least 10 cities that are the size or greater than Providence. So it's not just a question of it's a big state and there's more, it's less densely populated. But, to Governor DeSantis's credit, he realized early on some of the basic epidemiology in terms of how deadly this was in the elderly population, and to the best of his ability, and he wasn't 100% successful either. He tried to segregate them. For example, opposite what Cuomo did, he actually designated certain nursing homes as COVID only to try and at least segregate them. But whatever was done in Florida was at least done with the recognition that this is overwhelmingly a disease in terms of the worst consequences of the elderly. And I don't know why, but in the other, these northeastern states which had higher per capita mortality, I think Florida, last I looked, is about 27th in the country compared to the top four in the Northeast. We just didn't react in that way, and I think that's the biggest failing. And then on top of that, what Florida and Texas wound up doing was Florida to the greatest extent, I would say, other than maybe South Dakota, which has a smaller population and is much more open. Florida opted to engage in a strategy of protection of those that were most vulnerable, but to the greatest extent possible, reopening the state, understanding the profound economic consequences of lockdowns, and also their failure. I mean, you have to understand that lockdowns were rejected until COVID. Lockdowns were rejected in terms of epidemic planning because they just were felt that they would not actually be all that effective. If anything, you would delay. The virus would eventually, find its hosts, even if there was some time delay to that. And you would delay the achievement of herd immunity. These were what the great epidemiologists at the beginning of the end of the last century and the beginning of this century, believed when they were doing their pandemic planning, and they didn't believe in masking. They felt there were enough data to show that it was quite fruitless, it's not clear to me how the current paradigm just captured and took over the narrative and became enforced. And what's sadder still is that you see there are some outstanding epidemiologists, Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford and Martin Kulldorff from Harvard and Sunitra Gupta from Oxford, and they have tried to argue for this much more limited strategy relative to harsh lockdowns of allowing the working age populations to circulate, develop herd immunity, and do the best you could to protect those who were truly vulnerable. And they're demonized still to this day, even though, as far as I'm concerned, looking at things empirically, they've been shown to be correct. So it's just hard to understand how these narratives, despite the evidence, still remain in place. But in terms of what's happened in Rhode Island and going forward, I actually think we're in a pretty good place now. That we should be reopening much more than we have, Pat. And I think we had this big wave, the second wave of infections, but the silver lining to that is that it generates a lot of natural immunity. We also have, I could see, I have it written down here. We also have almost 86% of those 65 and older who've gotten at least one dose of the 2-dose vaccination schemes, and 73% that are now fully vaccinated. So that's our insurance in terms of preventing another huge spike and run on the hospitals, et cetera. And we should be taking advantage of that. We have a lot of damage to undo in terms of what the lockdowns did.
And let's speak to that for a second. In your professional opinion, and given the research you've done and the peers you've spoken with, the economic lockdown of Rhode Island, did it have any material impact, in your opinion, on the actual rate of transmission of the disease?
It's, again, if it did anything, there were certain delays. So I actually was, and I guess I was surprised at the significant number of infections we had in the second wave. Now, mercifully, a lot of them were not serious infections that required hospitalizations and worse, ICU and death. But I think that was a function of maybe too much lockdown during the first wave, and not allowing those that were less susceptible to get the milder and mildest forms of the disease and spread the herd immunity, and then just basically have to be waiting for the vaccine, et cetera. So I don't know. It seems as if the states that were more open didn't have as severe, a second wave. But I just think, a lot of this is now water under the bridge. What concerns me, I guess, most, Pat, and you've asked these questions, multiple weeks in a row now during the pressers, is like, okay, already, it's like we've had this, 2 to maybe 2.5% infection rate, for 2 months now. States that have actually slightly higher background infection rates are open and they seem to be doing fine. What gives? What's it going to take? And like I said, Pat, the fact that we have the highest risk population in the state almost fully vaccinated already, and you get about, if you look at Pfizer, Moderna, it's at least 70, maybe 80% in terms of what you're going to get out of the vaccine with the single shot. Mm-hmm. I don't understand. I don't understand what we're waiting for. And this is what concerns me.
Well, for a lot of people, what's confounding them is, first of all, if an authority figure, if in your life you have tremendous respect for authority figures, when authority figures appear to be in control of the situation and appear to deliver a message that you'll be safe as long as you do what I say, and then right, mix that with the confounding equation that somehow people being exposed at the level that existed over the last 5 or 6 months would actually, in the short term, spike some numbers, but in the long term would create this quote-unquote herd immunity, would create a level of immunity out in society, is confounding to them. Because, on one hand, the authority figures are saying, stay inside, lock the doors, close the windows, put wet cloths around the windows, wear a mask inside. I mean, there was a point in time when the governor of the state of Rhode Island was advocating that even in the quote unquote pods, if you will, that no one had paid attention to, by the way, in public education. I have that on numerous teachers' firsthand testimony. But at home, there was actually for a week a narrative that existed that, for example, in my case at the time, we had 3 of us living at home, that you should be wearing masks amongst the 3 of you in your home.
Oh, remember those? I mean, there was this hideous cartoon that they published around Thanksgiving about the socially distanced and masked Thanksgiving that you were supposed to have, even with with your family, and then God forbid you had a few people over as guests. And by the way, if you look at what was going on, Pat, before Thanksgiving, we had already taken, the genie was out of the bottle. We were already taking off in what turned out to be a big, infection wave. So you can't really say it's because of how people, socialized during the holiday season. We were on the very steep part of the curve before Thanksgiving and before Christmas. It's just not true. And there's a seasonality effect to that SARS is following, like other coronaviruses and like influenza. Mm-hmm. There are things that are largely, one of the most striking things that I remember reading about was it couldn't be. It's still not clearly understood to this day, but the much far worse, 20, 30 times worse. 1918 influenza pandemic actually spiked almost simultaneously on both sides of the Atlantic, here and in Europe. And it doesn't. I mean, theoretically, maybe it had something to do with the jet stream. I mean, that's so you got to wear a mask to protect you, from something that's transatlantic. And by the way, masks failed during the 1918 pandemic. There was a very poignant mea culpa written by a microbiologist who also served as a public health official in Northern California. And he wrote a paper in 1920, and he talks about how compliant people were, certainly in Northern California, with the masks. And he said it didn't have an iota of impact on the epidemic curve, unfortunately. He said, so we should really readdress, this is 1920, Pat, we should really readdress our theories as to, why masking didn't work, and here we are 100 years later, and the same thing happened with this pandemic.
Well, in addition to herd immunity, there's also the concept of herd behavior. We live in a country right now where there is an entire segment of society that is willing to condemn people who simply don't react to government dogma in the manner that they do. And their ability to condemn people in the fullest sense, by the way. I mean, you've now got the legitimate onset, if you will, of inoculation shaming. You've got the legitimate concept of mask shaming. You've got
How about going to a baseball game shaming, Matt? I mean, you can look at the pictures out of Arlington Stadium, and the morons in Texas have just created a super spreader event. Or look at what happened when Tom Brady had the temerity to take his mask off and celebrate the Super Bowl victory. That he was going to cause an outbreak that was going to affect all of the Tampa environs, and of course, none of this happened.
Or the fact that a few thousand bikers get together somewhere in the Midwest, right. And that was
vile. That was truly vile. That was truly vile because serious analyses of that showed that it was a bunch of crap. It really had. There was nothing that could be traced there in any way that was a so-called super spreader event.
Right. I used to joke that there were 2 types of people who could predict incredibly dire circumstances or predict or advocate for an incredible expenditures of money, and then the next day there would be a collective amnesia. And those, of course, were weather forecasters. I don't remember the last time anyone went back over a year's history of any of the fine folks at Channel 10 or 12 and said, okay, this is what you predicted. This is what happened. People who, come out with these incredible bond issues who say it's going to be spent for this, this, and this, and we never hear from it again. And now, of course, there are people who make prognostications with respect to, a pandemic, quote unquote, a dreaded disease, and who are public policy follows them. And yet when, I'll date myself here, when the great Rosanna, what was her line? It was the other character she played. Never mind. There's an awful lot of that going on.
Or Yogi Berra, Yogi Berra's advice. I never make predictions, especially about the future.
Yeah.
It's just.
But it's we've now got a culture of shaming based on prognostications that have been almost criminally wrong at every level. And that's why I look at the situation in Rhode Island and I see lives ruined, absolutely ruined. Yeah. And I've never taken this disease lightly, by the way, for anyone who listens to this in the future. I've always been very careful. I'm in that dynamic in terms of people that it could wipe out. I just am. And so,
I guess, Pat, I guess the real issue is like I said, all right, let's let bygones be bygones. Everybody made mistakes, whether they predicted things that were too severe or too mild, at various points in the past year. I was actually, mea culpa. I didn't think that we were going to see as big a spike in infections as we saw, with the second wave. I still think everything, when you fully account for everything, I still think the first wave was worse, even though by certain measures, the second wave, looks harsher. I think that's a function of the absurd amount of testing that was done and how that filters into the system. Once there's a label of COVID, even in the absence of a real clinical diagnosis, just a positive test, too many things carry through the system. But that's a separate issue. But still, I admit I didn't expect that many infections in the fall. I guess I had underestimated. I thought more infections had spread in the spring, and there was a higher level of natural immunity. But at any rate, here we are now. And again, what concerns me and what's concerned you, obviously, at the last month's worth or so of press conferences, is that we're looking at states that are open and wide open. Florida, South Dakota have been open for a long time. Both of them are doing better than we are doing. Florida, considerably better. Texas, our second largest state, considerably better. What are we waiting for? I don't understand it.
Well, and with respect to the second spike, the first spike we weren't prepared for. We had no idea what we were really dealing with, on a societal level at least. On the second spike, there was a considerable concession by society adhering to every single safety aspect prescribed to them by federal, state, and local governments. And
Pat, you pointed out the survey data right as we were really taking off in November. And again, this was before Thanksgiving. You pointed out that Rhode Island was the most mask compliant state in the entire United States, at 96% mask compliance.
Right.
Right as things took off.
Right. And there was a day where arguably you could say that we were the most mask compliant state, if there was a state whose hands, the new state image could be a hands rubbed raw from pure alcohol and being set on fire, that coincided with also, there was a day in American history where Rhode Island beat Serbia for our infection rate.
Well, right. And Pat, just within the last couple of days, laughing, which I didn't think was very funny, Dr. Jha mentioned, "Oh yes, the CDC has now decided that since it's not really spread by fomites but contact, etc. We can ease up on the compulsive cleaning and things like that have driven restaurant owners and everybody else, frankly, store owners crazy."
Right.
just as if it's a joke. It's not a joke. Just like the models that they gave us are not a joke. I mean, these are things that will have to be addressed. But again, I'm willing to let bygones be bygones. What are we going to do to reopen the state, to get rid of this useless mask mandate? Now that we've got, a tremendous amount of naturally acquired immunity and vaccine augmented immunity in the most vulnerable. What is the plan going forward?
I don't think there's going to be a plan, and I'll tell you why. First of all, a woman by the name of Liz Tanner, who is one of those nameless, shapeless, selfless, non-existent. In former Soviet Union, they called them apparatchiks, right? In Brezhnev era socialist workers' paradise, the type of person you never ever see, but who has a profound impact on your daily life. She heads something called the Department of Business Regulation. 3 initials that now strike perhaps greater fear into the average Rhode Islander businessman or woman than the other 3, which are IRS. And this is the, if you will, the repository of all things knowledgeable. We put up a video yesterday, a minute-long video clip, if you will, exercised in its entirety, not edited, from a meeting she had with the mayor of East Providence and the chief of staff for our Governor Dan McKay. And when asked about by an individual on this Zoom meeting whether or not at some of the events that were coming to the spring, if all parties have been inoculated, that whether or not they could go maskless, and you could see the inner, if you will, middle school principal in her come out and say, well, no, we are going to be masking for a considerable amount of time going forward. And now add that
you
to
saw that from Governor McKee today, Pat. I
right.
mean, in his interview with Tara Granahan, he
right.
mentioned already, without knowing what's going to be, that the kids will be going back to school in the fall, K through 12. I'm assuming he's meant in masks, and probably at the universities too. I mean, Roger Williams, in addition to mandating the vaccine, in the print story that was at WPRI, they talked about that they're going to continue their social distancing and mask mandates. I mean, this really, you begin to see that the discussion, and actually the original words do actually come from Davos and places like that. The Great Reset, is apparently is real. This is the way things are going to be.
Right.
Unless people fight it.
Right. They're talking about you'll hear music in Newport this summer. No. If in fact you combine herd immunity with a disproportionately high vaccination rate, then prove to me, before you continue to impose limitations on the small business community, prove to me what the science is underlying. Last week we went from 6 people at a table to 8 people at a table. Maybe it was 8 to 10. Right. Who knows at this point? I call it COVID porn. And I asked the question, where is the science underlying the move between the two? And I had a moment, kind of throw a flashback to my childhood, and I'm talking about those. Remember, once you can only see the Charlie Brown specials once a year, and when what would the parents say when in a Charlie Brown special? Wah 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 wah. That's what I got. And yet, here's the biggest frustration of all, Doctor. I ask these questions, and they look upon me as if I'm a science denier, as if I'm a doubter, as if my next step is to propose leeches, when in fact they're the ones peddling the lies. And
exactly. And the leeches
right.
Like the face. I mean, every week. Now she really seems to bristle, but Dr. Scott, has to make a point of emphasis. Masks work. I mean, Pat, notwithstanding the fact that the gold standard for interventions in medicine for the 40 years that I've been both a physical therapist and a physician are randomized controlled trials. Well, when it comes to masking to prevent community respiratory virus infections, we have 12 consecutive negative studies between 2008 and 2020. The last 2 studies that were published were just published in the fall, this past fall, and one involved COVID-19 itself in terms of masking to prevent infections, and in 5,000 Danes, and it was negative. And right before that was a study which was sort of a broad, published right before that, but conducted previously, actually before SARS-CoV-2, dealing with 6,500 Hajj pilgrims and randomized on tent, and a whole gamut of respiratory infections, primarily influenza and rhinovirus. None of them were prevented by the tents to any greater extent in the tents that masked. And in fact, there was a signal which suggested that the laboratory confirmed infection rate, as opposed to just the symptomatic assessment, the historical assessment, was actually worse in the masked group. It didn't quite reach statistical significance, but it looked to be about a 40% increased risk. So in the face of all this evidence, to then mandate masks as opposed to making them a recommendation is really science denial. It just and I understand if you're grasping at straws and there's really you're just at a loss. Well, maybe this will help. Well, maybe it'll give a certain reassurance. Well, then you have to be more guarded in your expectations, and certainly in your demands, and you also have to be wary of a phenomenon that the Scandinavians were concerned about, and why they don't mask kids in school, and they very limited masking in society, because they felt that the mask could actually serve as a temptation to people who are actively ill to go out and circulate, when the most important thing to do, since the infection is spread by symptomatic people, this whole idea of asymptomatic spread is additional nonsense. The public health officials in Scandinavia were pretty concerned that masking would encourage sick people to circulate in the population and make matters worse. So there's so many issues like that. But again, I come back to, not to beat a dead horse, can't we come up with a more constructive way, to move forward? Look at examples of states that are frankly doing better than ours, that are economically in a much better position, that have many more kids in school, and that are moving forward. What is it going to take to have that paradigm come to Rhode Island?
Well, there's a central problem out there. I'm going to draw an analogy between what I'll call the governmental / public health / economic, let's just call it government, and journalism. In journalism now, what passes for quote unquote journalistic behavior is what I call a press release journalism, or let's report on the reports of other journalists. So particularly on the web, you'll see a web story in the form of maybe on one of the newspapers or one of the big aggregator sites, Yahoo, Microsoft. You'll see a quote, and I'm using air quotes here, reporter using as a source someone else's reporting, which of course at some point is dependent on a combination of maybe an actual source or someone else's reporting. At this point in time, the circular logic that seems to exist and be generated by government directly is, well, the CDC said. All right. Then explain to me, before you make decisions that are going to affect a $1 trillion economy, explain to me the underlying science behind the CD. It is no longer good enough for any of us to simply take the alphabet soup that is American government and use that as an authority for literally anything. The CDC, they quoted somebody else.
And use it in a highly selective manner,
right?
Because I think there have been. I should put it this way: on occasion, there's actually been some useful information to come out of the CDC, and I think there are still some decent scientists down there if their work can get through and not be reorganized to fit an agenda. I think the CDC probably has it about right in terms of comparing the true extent of infections to those that are documented. So they use a figure of about 4.6-fold, and if you apply that to a state like ours, now it's a little muddier because we do so much asymptomatic testing, but But if you look at the number of infections that have been documented in the state, and you say, well, if it's not quite even if you just take half of the 4.6 fold, and then you add that to the people that have been vaccinated, and again, assuming some overlap, I think the reason that we're unlikely to see a significant spike is because probably at least half the state's immune at this point in some fashion or other.
And here's the real tragedy, and this is not to diminish the deaths across the nation from family members, friends, softball buddies, bowling league friends, old college roommates. That's not to diminish it all. But from a societal perspective, the real tragedy in my mind is at this point, we have eliminated, because of the use of agendas and hard sells and urban legends, and we've used myths to perpetuate a public health position that's based on sand, that there is virtually no trust in the American people in any of our governmental institutions at this point. Frankly, no one knows what to believe, because for many of us who are, say, our age, you and I are generally in the same age bracket, all right, we grew up in an environment where government was there to help. We were the children of World War II veterans. There was a nobility attached to it, and science was very much respected, and there were, if you were, checks and balances in the scientific world that prevented this sort of, I don't even know what you call it, massaging of information. Let's keep it a family show, right?
Right.
Massaging of information. And so, as someone, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an expert, I just simply play one on the radio, right? As someone who looks to truth, not public relations, I don't know where to turn anymore. I trust you. I've got a handful of other friends I consider subject matter experts, but when in the bigger picture, who the hell are you going to believe anymore?
Yeah, I think we're quickly moving to the point where we gotta trust your own lying eyes. I mean, don't rely too much on me either. I mean, I think people have to. And that's why, one of the things that the state has done, it's been a process. The Department of Health, one of the things I do respect about the Department of Health, as much as I've disagreed with so much of what they've done, they actually provide a lot of resources on that website, Pat. I'd like to spend, one day. I'd love, if the journalists were willing, I'd love to walk them through the website so that they can report it accurately. One of the things that they do, Pat, every day is, and actually maybe it's not the news so much the journalists' fault, they're just lazy. But the face page of the Department of Health website, for example, it was a classic today. I was pointing this out to people at WPRO. They'll describe 3 new deaths, when actually, if you go into the Google document on the website that's also updated every single day, you will see that, in fact, the last reporting period, which would be yesterday, there was 0 deaths. And what the 3 refers to is, it's an ongoing process. There'll be, as reports come in, as death certificates are reviewed, they will add deaths to multiple different days. And so those 3 deaths that they're reporting obviously didn't occur yesterday. They occurred on previous days, but not even on any given previous day. And so they're reported as new deaths. And when you're dealing with the period where we're in now, where there actually is, we are really coming down off the fall winter peak, and we're stabilizing at really low levels. The difference between 3 and 0 is a lot, Pat, and should be reported accurately by the date that it occurred. And this is a basic error that takes place every single day, Pat. And this is really, really bad when you're on the downside of the curve. It really overestimates, where you are. And this is just very unfortunate. And this kind of sort of illiteracy at such a basic level, over a year into this pandemic, I find it may seem like a trivial matter, but it's really not. I mean, you can't make an epidemic curve without reporting things on the day which they actually occurred. I mean, think about it. There's no dimension to date of report, especially if it could go back days to weeks to months. New Jersey was notorious for this. All of a sudden, you'd see these huge spikes, and you'd say, "What the hell happened?" Oh, well, we're reporting things from the first wave. In the second wave, we finally adjudicated these deaths at home or whatever they were, from the first wave. But we just got that information today, so we're dumping it into the system today. I mean, and reporters should know this. Certainly, reporters that and the guys, even the guys that read the news, today there were 3 new deaths, and what is the public to think? Well, 3 people died yesterday, when in fact no one, thank God, died the previous day.
Right. Well, we've we spent a considerable amount of time talking this evening. See how quickly it can go by when you don't have commercial interruptions and actually can develop a thought. It's magic. Any final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with tonight? And
please, Pat. Since you're the best at this, you're peerless when it comes to this, and I'm not just blowing your horn. Tomorrow, when you beat everyone to the mic, I don't know how you do it, but you do it. You really, this is an important issue for young people who this has been one of God's mercies to us with this whole last year, is that young people do really well with this, and you've got to ask what is the basis for even allowing, especially with an experimental vaccine, universities to mandate that kids have to be vaccinated before they come back to the campus. It's remind everyone, including the governor and Dr. Scott, that it's an experimental use application, that the emergency use application for basically what's an experimental vaccine till we know more about it.
Right.
And what is the situation, Pat? The data that's not out there. I calculated that there's at least 4,000 positive tests at only 6 of Rhode Island's universities and colleges since the fall. What are the number of hospitalizations of these kids? You've got at least 4,000 that tested positive. Maybe there's something that I'm missing, that others are missing, but tell us how many of them have been hospitalized. And if there's one particular campus maybe where things appear to have been worse, URI or Providence or whatever it was, maybe they had a cluster of hospitalizations. But something's got to justify mass vaccination of this very, very low risk population, and people in the state would be reassured if it turns out that we had about 4,500 positive tests among students since last summer or the beginning. But, only 2 kids, thank God, wound up in the hospital, and they wound up getting hydration because they were dehydrated from high fevers. And then the parents would say, whoa, wait a minute. I'm not so sure I want my kid vaccinated with an experimental vaccine to prevent that so-called outcome.
Well, all you need to know about university priorities is the fact that in many places, NCAA football, because of the sheer importance of money to universities, was allowed to happen at a time when the rest of the campus was having a collective nervous breakdown, talking about things like mandatory masking and enforced vaccinations. That's all you need to know about their priorities. And in fact, because of a breakout on the University of Rhode Island team football, it was reported this evening that they've ended their football schedule. Spring football schedule. So I know,
but Pat, there's a follow up to that. Even that point is like, okay, I'm sorry, some of these kids tested positive. A, how are they doing? Right. And B, let's see in a week from now, or certainly by 2 weeks from now, was a single one of these kids hospitalized? Did anyone even go to the emergency room to get rehydrated because they had high fevers, like happens every year with flu? I mean, we don't disrupt these kids' lives for each flu season. Although maybe that's what we're going to be doing from now on. I have no idea anymore. But these fundamental questions: how many of these college kids wound up in the hospital from the thousands who tested positive? Was it a handful, as I suspect? Maybe even none. and this is such critical information, and they never share this information with us, Pat. Never.
Right. No, because we are not you, but folks like me are the great unwashed, and it's far easier to give me those discerning, sort of disgusted glances as I question the new Bible, of course, the new dogma, thou shalt.
Pat, even with her mask on, you could see the furrows in Dr. Scott's forehead. I guess she hasn't had any Botox yet. She when you're questioning her, it's and of course when she takes the mask off, you can see the full disgust.
Well, no, it's I think I prefer the word loathing, and I'm 5 feet away. You're watching on a camera. But what is it? The new 10 Commandments: Thou shalt wash their hands. Thou shalt wear a mask. Thou shalt random test. Thou shalt inoculate. Jesus.
Right.
I don't know, but well, I think this is the beginning of a long conversation. I certainly appreciate you spending all this time with us tonight. We're going to put this. This was recorded this evening. We're going to get this out on the web tomorrow into prime time, and there's a lot of people out there looking for truths, and it's amazing how the human spirit can coalesce and work towards great things when they are given at least a semblance of the truth. And Americans were made to understand at some level the challenges they faced during World War II. And Americans responded in ways that are incomprehensible when looking at today's society.
Right.
Here we are with a situation that's being purported to be that same sort of existential crisis. And yet at the same time, we can't get those fundamental truths. And I would just close out tonight by saying that ultimately the way to rally people, and I've asked Gina this a half a dozen times, I've asked the current governor this, is to simply not put out a date certain. I get that. All right. I understand that. But simply a set of conditions to which, once met, will result in the ending of the unconstitutional executive order, the quote unquote reopening of our economy. I can't believe I still have to say that I need government to let me work, or reopen our government. And that ultimately months ago would have steeled the resolve, I believe, in most Rhode Islanders to meet that goal as quickly and as humanly possible. And the notion that we are more than a year out and that we don't have that is, to me, criminal.
Well, it's in the end, it's also confusing because he's, as Governor McKee said today to Tara Granahan, he wants the overflow facility dismantled. So obviously, It's not an emergency anymore, Pat. That defines it, really. I mean, to an ordinary person like me, it does.
Well, I just, end on this note. Interestingly enough, a few months ago, maybe it seems like a month or two ago, I asked the doctor at what point in time what our capital expenditures were on the overflow hospitals, and I didn't expect her to have it down to the dollar. In fact, I even asked her for a ballpark figure. She actually had no idea. Her press officer had to relay to her and then ultimately send me the numbers. We spent and this is just the capital expenditure, rental costs, things like that, as I understand it. We spent on field hospitals $31 million. $31 million.
I don't think, right, and I think they had a very low percentage occupancy compared to
according to facts related to me after the fact, approximately 650 Rhode Islanders were treated in a $31 million set of facilities, part of which, and this is really probably, I'm intimate because these are things that made me political, but part of that was a huge payment to the convention center, which quite frankly, I believe the COVID was a beard, if you know what I mean, to cover the fact that this is money given to the convention center so they wouldn't have a complete catastrophic loss. Which hemorrhages cash on a yearly basis for taxpayers. So they effectively channeled millions of dollars of Rhode Islanders' money that could have been spent on small businesses and or health relief in impoverished communities, Pick it. Take your choice. I'm good with either. All right. This is money that could have been spent there. Instead, it was spent basically to cover a political boondoggle, and that to me is criminal.
Yeah, and but it also the census that figures that you're given, you have to realize that that's spread out over months and months. So
right.
Again, the occupancy at any peak occupancy at any one given point must have been a fraction of what was planned for.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And again, to your point, the models. Who came up with the numbers upon which $31 million was spent because of the prognostication, if you will, that at peak incidence that we would have outgrown, or I should say, overwhelmed our hospitals.
Oh yeah, I think the tally from the Department of Health, I think we have about 865 beds in the state. So they were planning on a single day occupancy of up to 4,300.
Right. Right.
So,
and we didn't even come up with a total occupancy of 4,300.
Exactly. And for COVID itself, even with their, guidelines, it peaked in the first wave where they thought there was going to be 4,300 at 375, and we did get about 500 during the second peak. And that's with a lot of sort of loosey-goosey definition of who's really a COVID, in the hospital for COVID or just with COVID testing positive. So, but nothing came close to 4,300.
Yikes. Well, thank you for joining us, Dr. Bostom. We're going to pick this up again soon. I know that I enjoy our conversations offline. Let's just continue this moving forward. And and again, we appreciate you taking the opportunity to share with us so much of your insight, because there needs to be balance in the reporting of this. There needs to be balance in the analysis, the post-mortem conversations in terms of looking back. There needs to be a look back ultimately on how government handled this, because ultimately as a government if government effectively is going to take a monopoly on public health situations and not allow outside support, interference, whatever, then they ultimately are responsible for the results. I don't know if we'll ever see that day in Rhode Island, because the MO for Rhode Island is always, let's move on. We don't want to focus on the past. And so that we can guarantee we'll repeat our mistakes. Well, Dr. Andrew Bostom.
Thanks, Pat. But you go get them tomorrow. And if it comes to mind, it's the kids, the college kids, the grade school kids. Let's leave well enough alone. Let's not give them an experimental vaccine. Knowing what we know about how they do with this disease, and let's get some more data about what actually happened during these first and second waves to them before we even contemplate vaccinating them with an experimental vaccine.
We are the coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media, signing off for tonight. Tomorrow night's Thursday night. Tomorrow night we'll have some more outstanding programming. Hopefully the golf dudes will be on at 7:30, and we've got hopefully a surprise guest from the peaks, if you will, the summit of your Rhode Island government, your Rhode Island General Legislature. Have a wonderful night. We'll see you tomorrow.